The air in the Redemption Saloon was a foul mix of stale beer, sweat, and cheap cigar smoke. It clung to the back of Alara Vance's throat, a physical presence as oppressive as the silence that had fallen the moment she'd pushed through the bat-wing doors. Every eye, and there were dozens, had found her, traced the ruined landscape of the left side of her face, and then skittered away as if burned. She kept her own gaze fixed on the rough-hewn floorboards, her bonnet pulled low, a flimsy shield against their judgment. All she needed was cartridges. Jed was out. The saloon was the only other place that sold them, a grim concession to the realities of frontier life where whiskey and bullets were often dispensed from the same counter. She felt the presence before she saw it, a shift in the suffocating atmosphere. A pair of worn, expensive boots stopped in front of her. "Well, look what the wind blew in," a voice drawled, thick with casual cruelty. "The ghost of Vance Creek." Alara didn't have to look up. She knew the voice. Fletcher. Silas Kane's chief dog, a man whose soul was as barren as the alkali flats south of town. She tried to step around him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He blocked her path, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this, the power he held in this small, stinking room. "Where are you going in such a hurry, Ghost? The judge sent a message." Her voice was a rasp, barely audible. "I have no business with Mr. Kane." "Oh, I think you do." His hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was like iron. "He's a patient man, but his patience is wearing thin. He wants you off that land. He sent me to make sure you understand the generosity of his offer." His voice dropped, becoming a venomous whisper for her ears alone, yet loud enough for the men nearby to snicker. "He wonders how a broken thing like you can even work the land. Says it's a shame to look at." Shame, hot and familiar, flooded Alara's cheeks. It was a poison she had lived with for 3 years, ever since the cholera had scoured her family from the earth and left her as its marked remnant. She pulled against his grip, a futile gesture that only made him tighten it, a predator enjoying the struggle of its prey. The other patrons, ranch hands, prospectors, drifters, looked on. Some held a flicker of pity in their eyes, quickly extinguished by fear. Most just watched with the dull curiosity of men witnessing a dog being kicked. No one would help. No one ever did. "Let me go," she said, her voice trembling, but with an undercurrent of steel she hadn't known she possessed. Fletcher laughed a short, ugly bark. "Or what? You'll haunt me?" "I said," a new voice stated, low and calm as a deep river, "let her go." The voice cut through the saloon's grime with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. It came from the shadows near the door, a place no one had paid any mind. Fletcher turned, annoyed at the interruption. A man stepped forward. He was native, tall and lean, dressed in buckskins that had seen hard use but were meticulously cared for. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly alien to the clumsy, brutish movements of the men in the room. He carried no gun on his hip, only a long knife sheathed horizontally at the small of his back. His face was all sharp angles and planes, his black hair long and unbound, his eyes dark and fixed on Fletcher's hand on Alara's arm. It was Keem, the man she had found days ago, half dead in a bear trap on her property. The man she had been nursing back to a tense, watchful strength in her cabin. Fletcher sneered, sizing Keem up with a dismissive glance. "And who the hell are you? Her pet Indian?" Keem didn't answer the insult. He simply took another step forward, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the room. His focus remained singular, absolute. "You have one more chance." Overconfident and bolstered by his audience, Fletcher shoved Alara aside, making her stumble against a table. He turned his full attention to Keem. "Get out of here, savage, before I—" He never finished the sentence. Keem moved with a speed that defied belief. It wasn't a barroom brawl. It was a demonstration of terrifying efficiency. He flowed inside Fletcher's clumsy swing, one hand deflecting the punch while the other clamped onto the wrist. There was a sharp twist, a crack of bone, and a scream from Fletcher as his pistol, which he'd been reaching for, clattered to the floor. Before Fletcher could even register the pain, Keem had spun him around, an arm coiled around his throat, and the cold, dark steel of his knife held flush against Fletcher's jugular. The entire saloon was frozen in a state of collective shock. Men who lived and breathed violence had never seen it delivered with such swift, silent, and utter finality. Kamei's voice was unchanged, still a low, deadly calm that was more frightening than any shout. He spoke to Fletcher, but his words were for the entire room. She is not alone. He held the pose for a heartbeat longer, letting the message sink into the wood, the glass, the very souls of the men watching. Then he released his hold, shoving Fletcher to his knees. Fletcher crumpled, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of agony and humiliation. Kame's dark eyes swept the room once, a silent warning to every man there. He then turned to Alara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He nodded towards the door. Without a word, she turned and walked out, her back straight, her head held higher than it had been in 3 years. Kame followed, the batwing doors swinging shut behind them, leaving a tableau of stunned silence and the whimpering of Kane's humbled enforcer. The ride back to her homestead was silent, the only sounds the creak of Alara's saddle and the soft tread of Kamei's footsteps on the dusty track beside her mule. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the vast Montana sky in hues of orange and violet. The beauty of it was lost on her. Her body still thrummed with a terrifying mix of adrenaline and residual shame. Her arm ached where Fletcher had gripped it. She risked a glance at the man walking beside her. In the days since she'd found him, he had been a quiet, watchful presence in her small cabin. She had cleaned and bound the grievous wound on his leg, the flesh torn to the bone by the rusted teeth of a bear trap she knew hadn't been hers. She'd shared her meager food and given him the small cot by the fire, her medical knowledge, a bitter inheritance from watching the town doctor fail against the cholera, serving him well. He, in turn, had said little, answering her questions with curt nods or single words. He watched everything, his eyes missing no detail of her solitary life. The way she mended her own clothes, the calluses on her hands from chopping wood, the weary slump of her shoulders when she thought no one was looking. His actions in the saloon were a thunderclap in the oppressive silence of her existence. No one had ever stood for her, not once. When the cholera had swept through 3 years ago, claiming her mother, her father, and her younger brother in the space of a single hellish week, the town had offered condolences from a distance. But when she had emerged from the quarantine, alive but scarred, they had treated her like an omen. The whispers followed her, the stares, the pity that felt more like revulsion. She was a living reminder of the plague, a ghost, just as Fletcher had said. This isolation had been her penance for surviving. She had accepted it, until Silas Kane arrived. She remembered his first visit a week ago, a serpent in a tailored suit. He had ridden up to her cabin on a magnificent black stallion, flanked by Fletcher and another hard-faced man. Kane was handsome, silver-haired, his voice a smooth, cultured balm that barely concealed the poison beneath. "Miss Vance," he had begun, tipping his hat with a smile that never touched his cold blue eyes. "Silas Kane, your neighbor, in a manner of speaking." He had praised her tenacity, her father's good name, all the while his gaze flickered to her scars, a flicker of distaste she had seen 1,000 times. Then came the offer, wrapped in false concern. "This is no place for a woman to be alone. The winters are harsh, the work unforgiving. I am prepared to offer you a generous sum for this land, more than fair, enough for you to start a new life somewhere more comfortable." The land was all she had left. It was a humble plot, rocky and difficult, but it held the dust of her family. It held the headwaters of the Vance Creek, the only reliable water source in the entire valley outside the River Kane already controlled. That, she suspected, was the real prize. "It's not for sale, Mr. Kane," she had said, her voice small but firm. The mask of civility had slipped just for a second. A chilling stillness had come over him. "Everything has a price, Miss Vance," he'd said, his voice dropping. "Everything and everyone. I will have this land. Your cooperation simply determines the cost." The threat hung in the air long after he had ridden away. She had gone to the law. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his shirt, had listened to her story from the safety of his tilted back chair, his boots propped on his desk. He'd known her father, had even bounced her on his knee as a child. It meant nothing now. Kane is a businessman, Ilara, he'd sighed, not meeting her eyes. A pillar of this community. He made you a fair offer. What do you want me to do? Arrest the most powerful man in the territory for having a conversation? When she had insisted it was a threat, he had grown agitated, his face flushing. Go home. Stay out of trouble. Don't go poking the bear. She had left his office with a cold stone in her stomach. The law was Kane's law. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. That evening, checking the snares her father had taught her to set, she had found Kimi. The bear trap was old, not one of hers, placed cruelly on a game trail near her creek. He had been feverish, his leg mangled, but his eyes burned with a defiant fire. He'd told her to leave him, his voice a low growl of pain and pride. But she couldn't. I've seen enough people die, she'd told him, the words tasting like ash. Together, with her straining against a branch for leverage and him gritting his teeth against the agony, they had freed him. Helping him back to the cabin, cleaning the wound, applying a poultice of yarrow and comfrey, it had felt like the first useful thing she had done in years. He had watched her every move, his gaze unsettlingly direct. That first night, as she tended the fire, he had finally spoken, his voice a low rumble. Those marks, he'd said, nodding toward her face. Ilara had frozen, bracing for the inevitable. Pity, disgust, a clinical question. They tell a story, he continued, his eyes holding hers, seeing past the surface. They say you fought a great battle, and you won. The words had struck her with the force of a physical blow. Won. No one had ever considered that she had won anything. She had survived, yes, but it had always been framed as a tragedy, a lesser fate. In his eyes, in the quiet timbre of his voice, she heard a truth she had never allowed herself to believe. Her scars were not a mark of ruin. They were a testament to her strength. A single tear had traced a path through the dust on her unscarred cheek. It was the first tear she had shed, not from grief or shame, but from a profound, earth-shattering sense of being truly seen. Now, riding beside him, the memory of that moment was a small, warm coal in the cold pit of her stomach. His actions in the saloon were not charity. They were the actions of an ally. They arrived at the homestead as the last light faded. The small log cabin, her fortress and her prison, looked fragile against the encroaching darkness. Kame stopped and looked around, his head cocked, listening to the night. "What is it?" she asked, dismounting. "Nothing," he said. "And that is what is wrong. No crickets, no night birds. The night is holding its breath." He moved to the cabin, pushing the door open, his hand hovering near the knife at his back. Ilara followed, her own rifle feeling heavy and useless in her hands. The confrontation in town was not an ending. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it was only the beginning. Kane would not tolerate humiliation. He would not tolerate defiance. He had promised to make her understand the cost, and the bill was coming due. The cost arrived sooner than she could have imagined. A few days after the saloon incident, Ilara went to the well, the one her father had dug with his own 2 hands. The bucket came up light, scraping against the stone sides. When it surfaced, it was filled with mud, slimy rocks, and the bloated, furry body of a dead rabbit. The water was a thick, brown slurry. She stared down into the darkness, her heart sinking. The well rope, a thick hemp cord she'd checked just last week, had been deliberately cut. The stone lining was collapsed inward. Sabotage. It was a cruel, calculated blow. Without the well, the cabin was just a wooden box on a barren plot. The nearest fresh water was the creek, a quarter-mile walk to the far edge of her property. It was a message of methodical cruelty. We can touch you whenever we want. We can take the very water you drink. Kame appeared beside her, his tread so silent she hadn't heard him approach. He looked into the well, his expression grim. He didn't need to ask who did it. He walked a slow circle around the well, his eyes scanning the ground. Even to her untrained eye, the hoofprints were clear, the tracks of 2 shod horses. "Kane's men," he stated, his voice flat. He pointed to the creek. "That water is cleaner. It comes from the mountain. It is the reason he wants this land. His words, meant to be practical, landed as a revelation. She had always seen the creek as a boundary line, a feature of the property. He saw it as the heart, the source of life. The very thing Cain coveted was the thing that would keep her alive. It was a small shift in perspective, but it felt monumental. That evening, she made a decision. Her father's old Winchester rifle, which she kept loaded by the door, was more of a talisman than a tool. She knew how to load and fire it, but her aim was shaky, her movements uncertain. That was no longer good enough. She found Keem sitting outside sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shk, shk, shk of steel on stone was a soothing sound in the twilight. "Teach me," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. He stopped looking up at her. He didn't ask what she meant. He simply nodded. Their lessons began the next day and became a new routine, a ritual of survival forged in the Montana dust. He was a patient, demanding teacher. He adjusted her stance, tapping her shoulder. "Your body must be a part of the earth. Strong, rooted." He corrected her grip on the heavy rifle. "Do not fight the gun. Let it be an extension of your will." He taught her to breathe. "Anger makes your hands shake. Fear clouds your vision. Breathe out the noise. See only the target." At first she was clumsy. The rifle's kick bruised her shoulder. Her shots went wide, kicking up dirt far from the tin can he'd set on a fence post 50 yards away. Frustration gnawed at her, but Kimi was relentless in his quiet encouragement. "Again," was all he would say, and she would reload, settle her stance, and try again. Slowly, something shifted. She learned to quiet the noise in her head, the whispers of the town, the ghost of Fletcher's sneer. She began to feel the solid weight of the rifle, the satisfying clink of the lever action, the precise alignment of the sights. Then came the day she fired, and instead of a puff of dust, the can leaped into the air with a gratifying ping. A smile, a real, unguarded smile, touched her lips. She looked at Keem, who simply nodded, a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. It felt like a greater victory than anything she had ever known. His lessons extended beyond the rifle. He taught her to read the land as he did. He showed her how a bent blade of grass told of a passing deer, how the sudden silence of birds could signal a predator, how the smell of pine on the wind could predict the weather. He would stop, crouch, and point. "Cain's men rode this way 3 days ago. See how the horse chips are dry? But here the track is fresh. A single rider, watching." He was teaching her to see not just with her eyes, but with all her senses. The world, which had been a backdrop for her lonely existence, came alive with meaning, with warnings and secrets. In the evenings, by the fire, they would speak. He told her stories, not of his own past, which remained a locked room, but of his people. He spoke of the buffalo, the seasons, the spirits of the mountains and the rivers. He spoke of a world with a rhythm and a balance that the white man's world of fences and deeds could not comprehend. In turn, she found herself talking about her family. She spoke of her father's booming laugh, her mother's skill with needlepoint, her little brother's obsession with frogs from the creek. The memories were still painful, but speaking them aloud to him felt like taking them out of a dusty box and letting them breathe. He listened, his attention absolute, giving her memories a weight and dignity she hadn't felt them possess before. Their shared existence in the small cabin was a dance of quiet respect. They were two solitary souls who had found an unlikely orbit around each other, bound by a shared threat and a dawning, unspoken understanding. Alara felt a change in herself, a hardening of her resolve, a quiet confidence that began to fill the spaces hollowed out by grief and shame. She was no longer just the scarred girl, the cholera ghost. She was a woman learning to fight for her home, for her life. And she was not alone. The sense of security was a fragile thing, however, easily shattered. One afternoon, Kimi announced he was going hunting, that their supplies were low. She felt a pang of anxiety at being left alone, but she nodded. She had to be able to stand on her own. Hours later, as the sun began to set, a rider approached. Not Cain's men. It was Sheriff Brody, his horse looking weary. He dismounted, holding his hat in his hands, his gaze shifting nervously around the property. "Alara?" he started, his voice strained. There's there's talk in town about what happened at the saloon. Kane is furious, not just about Fletcher's arm. You made him look weak. And the Indian? He shook his head. He's putting a bounty out. $300 for the Indian, dead or alive. $50 for anyone who helps you. The blood drained from Alara's face. A bounty. He was turning the entire territory into his personal posse. Greed and fear would be his weapons now. He's trying to isolate you, Brody continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. He wants you helpless. Jed Croft told me to tell you he can't sell you supplies anymore. Not openly. It's too dangerous. Alara, you have to leave. Take what you can and ride out. There's no winning this. This is my home, she said, the words coming out with a ferocity that surprised them both. Brody looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the broken girl he'd dismissed, but a woman with fire in her eyes. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. Then God help you, he said, mounting his horse, because Silas Kane won't stop until he's standing on your grave. He rode off, leaving his warning hanging in the twilight air. The bounty changed everything. Now every stranger was a potential threat, every shadow a potential killer. The small flame of hope that had been kindled within her flickered, threatened by a rising, chilling wind. When Kimi returned an hour later, a rabbit slung over his shoulder, he found her sitting on the porch, the Winchester across her lap, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. He could read it in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way she held the rifle. She told him about Brody's visit, about the bounty. He listened without expression, his gaze distant. He is a rich man, Keem said when she was finished. And rich men think everything can be bought. They'll come for you, she whispered, the fear for him a sharp pain in her chest. For money, men in this territory will do anything. Let them come, he said, his voice devoid of bravado, a simple statement of fact. He looked at her, his eyes seeming to pierce the twilight gloom. Fear is his goal. It is a poison. Do not drink it. But that night, sleep offered no respite. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind was the sound of approaching danger. Alara lay on her cot, her eyes wide open in the darkness, the rifle by her side. Fear was a poison, Keem had said. She could feel it seeping into her, cold and paralyzing. She was no warrior. She was just a girl with a scarred face and a rifle she was still learning how to use. Standing against the wealthiest, most ruthless man in the territory. Sheriff Brody's words echoed in her mind. There's no winning this. The attack came just before dawn, in that gray, disorienting hour when the night is at its blackest. It was Keem who saved them. A flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, a shadow that didn't belong. He was on his feet in an instant, his voice a sharp whisper that cut through her troubled sleep. They're here. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. But then Kami's training took over. Breathe out the noise. She scrambled from the cot, grabbing the Winchester. Kami was already barricading the door with the heavy table, shoving a trunk against the flimsy shutters of the single window. How many? She asked, her voice shaking. 6, he said, his own eyes scanning the darkness outside through a crack in the logs. They're spreading out, trying to surround us. The first shot shattered the pre-dawn stillness, ripping through the cabin wall just inches from her head. Splinters exploded inward. Alara cried out, dropping to the floor. The world became a terrifying cacophony of gunfire, shouting, and the thud of bullets burying themselves in the logs of her home. This was it. The real test. Kime was a study in lethal calm. He moved from the door to the window, a ghost in the dim light. He didn't waste shots. He would watch, wait, and then fire his own rifle. One he'd produced from a hidden bundle, with deadly precision. A cry of pain from the darkness outside told of his success. The east side, he snapped. They're trying for the barn. Alara crawled to a small gap in the chinking on the eastern wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. She peered out. In the growing light she could see a figure, a man with a torch, running towards the old dry wood of the barn where her mule was stabled. The barn held the last of her father's tools, the hay for the winter, the physical remnants of her family's life. See only the target. She pushed the barrel of the Winchester through the gap. The man was a dark shape against the gray landscape. She lined up the sights, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't a tin can. This was a man trying to burn down what was left of her world. Breathe. She exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man with the torch screamed, dropping it as he clutched his shoulder. He staggered back into the trees, his mission failed. A wave of nausea and shock washed over her. She had shot a man. She had shot a man, and a part of her, a fierce, primal part she never knew existed, was glad. The firefight raged on, feeling like an eternity. Kime moved with an economy of motion, his presence a steadying force in the chaos. He took down another attacker with a clean shot. The assault faltered. The attackers, having lost two of their number and facing a defense far more ferocious than they'd anticipated, changed tactics. A new light flared outside, bright and orange, not from a torch. "The barn," Kime said, his voice grim. They had set it ablaze as a diversion. The remaining attackers melted back into the woods, their gunfire fading. The immediate threat was gone, but a new one, a roaring monster of orange flame, was devouring her past. "The mule!" Alara cried, scrambling to unbarricade the door. They burst outside. The heat from the burning barn was intense, a physical blow. The dry timbers were fully engulfed, a funeral pyre against the dawn sky. It was too late for the barn, too late for the tools, the memories, but she could still save her animal. She ran towards the corral behind the barn, Keem right behind her. The mule was braying in terror, its eyes wide. Alara unlatched the gate, slapping its rump to send it galloping into the safety of the pasture. They stood there, side by side, helpless, as the roof of the barn groaned and collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the sky. The rising sun revealed a scene of devastation. The smoldering ruins, the bullet-pocked walls of the cabin, the blood on the ground where Kane's men had fallen. Despair, black and absolute, washed over Alara. They had survived the attack, but this felt like a mortal wound. She looked at the ruin, at the smoke staining the morning sky, and her hard-won resolve crumbled into ash. "He'll never stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a terrible, empty weariness. "He'll just keep coming. He'll send more men. He'll burn the cabin next. He'll burn everything until there's nothing left." She turned to Keem, her eyes wide with a new fear, a fear for him. "He'll kill you too. All for nothing. For this worthless piece of land." Keem was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the smoldering ruin to her face, streaked with soot and tears. He took a step closer. Gently, he reached out and his fingers traced the line of the most prominent scar on her cheek. His touch was not one of pity, but of a profound, grounding tenderness. "He can burn wood," Kami said, his voice soft but resonant with an unshakable certainty. "He cannot burn the mountain. He cannot dry the river." His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw her own strength reflected. "He cannot burn what is inside you." He let his hand drop, but the warmth of his touch remained. "We have been waiting for his fire," he continued, a new, hard edge to his voice. "We have been defending. That is over." He looked towards the direction of Kane's vast ranch, a place of power she had only seen from a distance. "Naptain," he said. "We bring the fire to him." The words hung in the smoke-filled air. It was a declaration, a shift in the very axis of their struggle. The despair within her didn't vanish, but something else rose to meet it, a spark of defiant rage. He was right. She was tired of being the hunted, the victim, the ghost. The midpoint of her journey had been reached. She had been defending the ashes of her past. Now it was time to fight for a future. The decision to go on the offensive settled a new kind of quiet between them. It was not the quiet of fear, but of grim purpose. The following days were spent preparing, a silent industry of two against a kingdom. Kami disappeared for hours at a time, returning with knowledge. He had scouted Kane's sprawling ranch, mapping it in his mind. The number of guards, their routines, the layout of the buildings. He moved like a spirit across the land, unseen and unheard. Alara, meanwhile, took stock of their meager resources. They had rifles, but their ammunition was dangerously low after the firefight. Courage was their main weapon, but courage couldn't punch through the walls of a fortified ranch house. They needed help. And there was only one person she could think to ask. They rode to Redemption under the cover of a moonless night, tethering their horses in a thicket outside of town. Alara slipped through the back alleys to the rear entrance of Jedediah Croft's general store. She knocked softly, a coded rhythm her father had used. After a long moment, a bolt slid back and the door creaked open. Jed's face, illuminated by the lantern he held, was a roadmap of worry. Alara, what in God's name are you doing here? Brody said Kane's put a price on your head. That's why I'm here, Jed, she said, stepping inside. Keem followed, his presence making the cluttered storeroom feel suddenly small. Jed's eyes widened, but he said nothing. Alara didn't plead or beg. She laid the facts out, her voice low and steady. Kane's men attacked my homestead. They burned my barn. 6 of them. We fought them off, but they'll be back. The sheriff can't help. We're not running, we're going to stop him. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But we need ammunition. More than I can afford. More than you can safely sell me. Jed stared at her, this young woman he'd known her whole life. He saw the soot still smudged on her cheekbone, the new hard light in her eyes. He saw the ghost of her father, a man who had never backed down from a fight he believed in. He ran a hand over his balding head, his gaze falling on the silent native man standing behind her, a figure of lethal potential. He was being asked to choose a side openly. He let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of silent resentment against Kane's slow strangulation of the town. Your father, Jed said, his voice raspy. He once told me that a man who lets a wolf eat his neighbor's sheep will soon find his own flock gone. Kane's been the wolf in this valley for too long. He turned and walked deeper into the storeroom. He kicked aside a pile of burlap sacks, revealing a hidden trapdoor. He lifted it, revealing a small, dark cellar. He descended and returned with a heavy wooden crate. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled in wood shavings, were dozens of boxes of new Winchester and Colt cartridges, and a brand new, double-barreled shotgun. A man orders things, sometimes more than he needs, Jed mumbled, avoiding her eyes. Inventory gets lost. Take it. He pushed the crate towards her. Don't tell me where you're going. Don't tell me what you plan to do. Just make it count. The unexpected generosity, the sheer risk he was taking, brought a lump to Alara's throat. Jed, Go on now, get, he grumbled, turning away to busy himself with some sacks. Before my courage runs out. They slipped back into the night, their saddlebags now heavy with the tools of war. Jed's act was a single point of light in the darkness, a sign that Kane's foundation of fear was not as solid as he believed. Their luck, it seemed, had turned. 2 days later, as Alara was fetching water from the creek, a figure emerged from the willows. It was Sheriff Brody, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He looked like a man at war with himself. I can't sleep, he began without preamble, his voice a strained whisper, knowing what he's doing, knowing what he's planning. Alara and Keem, who had appeared at her side as silently as a shadow, waited. Kane's making his big move, Brody said, twisting the brim of his hat. The territorial land auction is next week. He's got it all rigged. The auctioneer, the judge. He's planning to use a list of phantom debts and foreclosures to claim half the homesteads in this valley, all legal and proper on paper. He's going to own everything. The scope of Kane's ambition was breathtakingly evil. He wasn't just a land grabber, he was a destroyer of lives on an industrial scale. Brody took a deep, shuddering breath, the confession spilling out of him. He keeps his real books at the ranch, a set of ledgers detailing all of it, the bribes, the illegal deeds, the men he's paid. It's all in a safe in his office. He finally looked at them, his eyes desperate. If a person could get their hands on those ledgers, it would ruin him. It would be proof. He then gave them the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. He has a big cattle shipment arriving tomorrow night, bringing them down from the North Range. He's sending most of his men, Fletcher included, to manage the drive. The ranch will be vulnerable. It's the best chance you'll ever have. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and plunged back into the trees, a man who had finally, belatedly, chosen a side, even if only as an informant. He was a weak man, but in that moment he had given them a key. That night, in the cabin, the air was electric. With Jed's ammunition and Brody's information, they had more than hope. They had a plan. Kime drew a map of Kane's ranch in the dirt on the floor with a piece of charcoal. The main house, the bunkhouse, the stables, the direction of the cattle trail. He had memorized it all. The plan was audacious, desperate, and hinged on perfect timing. It would be a two-pronged assault. The herd is his weakness, Cam explained, his finger tracing a line on the map. It is worth a great deal of money. He will protect it above all else. He looked at Alara. I will go here. He pointed to a spot upwind from the trail. I will start a fire. Not a big one. A grass fire. The wind will carry the smoke. The cattle will panic. They will stampede. A stampede. The chaos would be immense. It would draw Fletcher and the bulk of Kane's men away from the ranch in a desperate attempt to save the herd. It was brilliant. While they are fighting the fire and the stampede, he continued, his eyes finding hers, the ranch will be quiet. That is when you go in. Alara's breath hitched. Me? He will not expect you, Kami said simply. He looks for a warrior, a man. He will not look for a ghost. You are small. You are quiet. You will get the ledgers from his office. She looked at the map, at the circle representing the ranch house, the heart of her enemy's power. The thought of willingly walking into that place sent a tremor of fear through her. But the fear was different now. It was sharp and clear, not the paralyzing fog of her old life. It was the fear that comes before a necessary act of courage. She nodded. I'll do it. Before they separated to prepare, Kame reached into a small pouch at his belt. He pressed something into her hand. It was a small wooden bird carved with intricate detail from a piece of pale wood. It was smooth and warm to the touch. In my grandmother's stories, he said softly, this is the chokecherry bird. It is small, but its song is the first one heard after a long winter. It means hope. It means new beginnings. Alara closed her hand around it, the wood a solid, comforting presence. I never thought, she began, her voice thick with emotion, that I would have a reason to fight for a new beginning. Kim's gaze was steady, profound. I did not see a scarred woman cowering in a cabin. I saw a warrior who had survived a great fire and did not yet know her own strength. Now you do. He paused, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. Return with the dawn. He picked up his rifle and a water skin and melted into the darkness, leaving Alara alone with the carved bird, the weight of their mission and the burgeoning strength she was finally ready to claim as her own. The night was a vast, star-dusted blanket, cold and indifferent. Miles away from Alara, Kimi moved through it like a phantom. He ran with a steady, ground-eating lope that consumed the distance, his senses alive to the world around him. He found the cattle trail easily, a wide, trampled scar on the prairie. He could smell them on the wind. The scent of thousands of animals, a fortune on the hoof. He located the herd in a wide, grassy basin, watched over by a dozen riders who circled lazily, their cigarettes glowing like fireflies in the dark. Fletcher was among them, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of sullen anger. Kami watched them for a time, learning their rhythm, before retreating to a low ridge upwind. Here he worked quickly and methodically. He gathered dry grass and tinder, piling it into a long, thin line perpendicular to the wind. He was not creating an inferno, but a wall of smoke. He took a fire starter from his pouch, a simple bow drill, and with practiced ease he coaxed a glowing coal into life. He gently placed it in the tinder. The flames caught, licking at the dry grass. A thin ribbon of smoke rose, then thickened, caught by the steady prairie wind, and pushed directly towards the basin. Kimi did not stay to admire his work. He was already moving, circling around to a high vantage point to watch the chaos he had unleashed. The effect was almost instantaneous. The first scent of smoke reached the cattle, and a low, nervous rumble began to spread through the herd. Heads came up. The animals shifted, their bodies bunching together. The cowboys shouted, trying to calm their mounts in the herd, but it was too late. The thick, acrid smoke rolled over them, a terrifying, unnatural presence in the night. Panic erupted. A single steer bolted, and the chain reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The low rumble became a deafening thunder as 4,000 panicked animals surged into a full-blown stampede. They moved as one body, a terrifying river of horn and hoof directly away from the ranch. Fletcher's curses were lost in the din. He and his men were instantly consumed by the crisis, firing their guns into the air, yelling, desperately riding the flanks of the stampede to try and turn the herd before it scattered or ran itself to death. Their attention, their purpose, their entire world was now focused on the thundering mass of cattle. The ranch, and the monster who ruled it, were forgotten. Kami watched for a moment longer, a solitary figure illuminated by the distant firelight, then turned and began the long run back. The diversion was complete. While Kem's fire bloomed on the horizon, Alara began her own infiltration. She moved through the darkness, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. The carved bird Kame had given her was tucked into her pocket, a secret source of strength. She approached the Kane ranch from the rear, slipping through the woods that bordered his property. As Brody had promised, the place was eerily quiet. The bunkhouse was dark. Only a few lights burned in the main house. She counted 2 guards. They were jumpy, distracted by the faint, distant shouts and the ominous orange glow in the northern sky. They were watching the fire, not the shadows at their backs. Kime's lessons guided her feet. She moved from one patch of darkness to the next, her breathing slow and steady, her body an extension of the night. She reached the side of the sprawling ranch house and found what she was looking for. A window into what looked like a pantry, left slightly ajar to catch the night breeze. With painstaking slowness, she eased the window open and slipped inside. The house smelled of leather, polish, and money. It was a world away from her simple cabin. She moved silently through a large kitchen and into a grand hallway. The opulence was sickening. Plush carpets that swallowed the sound of her footsteps, fine paintings of tranquil landscapes, a wealth built on the misery of people like her. She found the office. The door was unlocked. She slipped inside, closing it gently behind her. The room was dominated by a massive oak desk. A single lamp cast a warm glow over stacks of papers. And there, behind a large painting of a charging buffalo, she saw the faint outline of a wall safe. She took the crowbar from the canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Her hands were slick with sweat. She took a deep breath. Breathe out the noise. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the heavy steel door and began to pry. The groan of protesting metal was horrifyingly loud in the silent house. She froze, listening. Nothing. She put her weight into it again, her muscles screaming. A loud crack echoed in the room as a hinge buckled. She worked frantically, the adrenaline singing in her veins. "I must admit," a soft voice said from the doorway, "I underestimated you." Alara spun around, her heart seizing in her chest. Silas Kane stood there, holding a lantern in one hand and a silver-plated revolver in the other. He wasn't with the herd. He hadn't been fooled. A smug, amused smile played on his lips. He was dressed in a silk robe, looking like a king who had just caught a mouse in his pantry. "I had a feeling," he continued, his voice a silky purr of satisfaction. He gestured with his revolver towards the safe. "You've made quite a mess of my wall, but then you seem to have a talent for leaving scars." His eyes crawled over her face, the contempt in them a physical blow. "All this trouble for a piece of paper? I thought I taught you the price of defiance when I burned your hovel of a barn." The mention of the barn, the casual way he admitted to it, ignited the spark of rage within her. The fear did not vanish, but it now had a partner. "You see?" he he said, taking a step closer, savoring her terror. In the end, you are just a broken thing in a place you don't belong, a ghost that doesn't know it's dead yet. He was trying to break her, to unravel her with his words before he killed her. But he was using the wrong insults. He was calling her by a name she no longer answered to. She was not a ghost. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. In a single, desperate motion, she grabbed a heavy glass inkwell from his desk and hurled it at him. It struck him in the face, shattering, spraying dark ink across his shocked features. He roared in surprise and pain, momentarily blinded. It was the opening she needed. She dove for her own pistol, which she'd set on the floor. Kane fired his revolver wildly, the bullet tearing through the sleeve of her shirt and grazing her arm with a line of fire. She cried out, stumbling, but grabbed her gun. She scrambled behind the massive desk as another of his shots splintered the wood where her head had just been. A desperate shootout began in the confines of the office. She was pinned down, Kane's shots methodically blasting chunks out of the desk. She was outmatched, trapped. Just then, from outside came a new sound, a sharp thwack followed by a choked cry. Then another. Keem had arrived. Realizing he was no longer in control, Kane's demeanor shifted from smug predator to cornered rat. He stormed to the office door, firing blindly into the hallway. "Come out, savage!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "Come and face me!" He then lunged back into the office, grabbing Alara by her injured arm and hauling her to her feet. He shoved the hot barrel of his revolver against her temple, using her as a human shield. He dragged her out onto the wide porch into the moonlight. "Come and see your prize!" Kane bellowed into the night. From the darkness near the stables, Kane emerged. He stood alone, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked and aimed at Kane's heart. The two enemies faced each other, with Alara caught between them. It was a stalemate. A perfect, terrible standoff. Kane laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "What will you do now, hero? Shoot through her to get to me?" Alara's mind raced. Kimi couldn't get a clear shot. She looked at him, trying to convey a message with her eyes. They had practiced for this, in a way. Not this exact scenario, but the principle. Create an opening. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then, with all her strength, she stomped her boot down hard on Kane's polished shoe, grinding her heel into his instep. As he grunted in pain, she drove her elbow backward into his ribs with vicious force. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. His body shifted. It was all the opening Keem needed. Alara dropped to the porch floor. The air above her hissed. Kami's arrow flew, silent and true, and buried itself deep in Silas Kane's chest. A look of stunned surprise crossed Kane's face. He looked down at the feathered shaft protruding from his silk robe, then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. But it wasn't over. The sound of hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Fletcher and two other men, having abandoned the stampede, reined in their horses, their faces illuminated by the lights from the house. They saw their fallen boss, Alara, on the ground, and Kimi with his bow. "Kill them!" Fletcher shrieked, raising his pistol. Chaos erupted. Kimi loosed another arrow, felling one of the riders from his horse. He dropped his bow, drawing a pistol he'd taken from a guard. Alara, scrambling, grabbed Kane's fallen silver revolver. The world narrowed to muzzle flashes and the deafening roar of gunfire. A bullet kicked up dirt near her head. She fired back at Fletcher, the heavy revolver bucking in her hand. Her shot went wide, but it forced him to duck behind his horse. Keem was a deadly force moving between the porch columns, but he was outnumbered. Fletcher took aim, a clear shot. Suddenly, a deafening boom echoed from the darkness near the bunkhouse. A blast of buckshot tore through the air, hitting Fletcher square in the chest and sending him flying from his saddle. Out of the shadows stepped Sheriff Brody, a smoking, double-barreled shotgun in his hands. His face was grim, resolute. The last surviving gunman, seeing Fletcher fall and the sheriff standing there, threw his pistol to the ground and raised his hands high. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the groaning of the wounded man and the ragged sound of Alara's breathing. It was over. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky with soft pastels that belied the night's violence. The Kane Ranch, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a crime scene. Sheriff Brody, a changed man, moved with newfound authority, directing a few deputized townsmen who had arrived with him. The surviving gunman was in makeshift cuffs, and Kane's body lay under a blanket on the porch. The prize, the ledgers from the safe Alara had managed to pry open after the fight, sat on the hood of the sheriff's buggy, their pages a testament to years of corruption. Alara sat on the porch steps, Kame silently tending to the gunshot graze on her arm. It was a clean wound, painful but not serious. He worked with a gentle focus, his touch firm and reassuring. When he was done, he simply sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They watched the sun climb higher, burning away the last of the night's shadows. Brody walked over, his face etched with exhaustion and something that looked like relief. "Those ledgers," he said, nodding towards the buggy. "They're even worse than I thought." He had judges, land agents, even a territorial senator on his payroll. This isn't just going to clean up redemption, it's going to clean up the whole territory. He looked down at Alara, and for the first time since she was a little girl, he looked at her without a trace of pity or awkwardness. He looked at her with respect. "You did what the law couldn't, Alara. What I was too afraid to do." "We did it," she corrected softly, glancing at Kami. Brody nodded. "What will you do now?" It was a question she hadn't allowed herself to consider. A future beyond survival. "I'm going home," she said. A week later, the valley was still reeling from the revelations in Kane's ledgers. Arrests were being made, ill-gotten deeds were being voided, and the town of Redemption was breathing freely for the first time in years. Alara stood by the creek on her homestead, the water cool and clear against her skin. She looked at her reflection in a still pool. The scars were there, a permanent map of her past. They hadn't vanished. But she saw them differently now. They were not a disfigurement. They were a story of survival, a testament. She saw the woman Keem had seen from the very beginning. He approached, his footsteps soft on the damp earth. He had stayed, his own journey temporarily set aside for a new one he was discovering here with her. The town council, led by a newly emboldened Jed Croft, had offered him a reward, the bounty money Kane had promised, calling him a hero. He had refused it. "They still don't know what to make of you," Alara said, a small smile playing on her lips. "The hero who won't take their money." He shrugged, his gaze on the distant mountains. "We survived. That is the reward." She looked at him, at his strong, quiet presence that had become the anchor of her new world. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. Her smile widened, genuine and unguarded. "Yes," she said. "We did." The final image was not of a grand celebration, but of quiet, meaningful work. Under the vast Montana sky, Alara and Kimi were rebuilding the barn. He hoisted a heavy log into place while she hammered a peg to secure it. They moved in an easy rhythm, a synchronicity that needed no words. They were two outcasts, a scarred woman and an exiled warrior, who had faced down a tyrant and found not just victory, but a home. They were building a future together, not on the ashes of the past, but with the strong, tested timber of their own resilience. The sound of her hammer echoed across the valley, a steady, hopeful beat in the heart of the wild.